In this video, we're going to look at classes and what they are and how you use them. So, let's see here. In the previous module, we did talk about classes already. And, come on, you. We, we saw how classes are used to group data and processing code, in other words, variables and functions, by creating a very simple class. Now, a couple things to note is that your variables, when you make a class, are referred to as fields. And your functions, when they're in a class, are referred to as methods. Now, exactly why we have to have different names for these things, I don't know, but it is, they are. There are some slight differences in the way you type them out sometimes, like in Python, the way you type out a function that's considered a method is slightly different than a function without, but not really that much. It's not that big a deal. Variables look exactly the same, even though they're called fields. Here's an example. Let's say I make an object called a class called customer, and I inherit from the basic template of all classes called the object class. So that's what this code says. I add in an ID and a name variable. Oh, I don't call them variables, I call them fields now. And I add in a function called toString. Oh, I don't call it a function, I call it a method now. Now, one of the differences between a function and a method is the word self. Using the word self indicates that this is actually a method used for objects that are created from the class. In this case, I'm returning the ID and the name as a string, so nothing really fancy going on. But the way you use this code is you actually create an object from it. So we saw in the last module how that would work. You go through and say, I want to make a new object from the customer class. You give it some kind of name, like I've called one object customer1. And it would create for all intents and purposes, a copy of this code at an address in memory. Now that address would be something, I don't know what it would be, but let's say it's at address 214. If you then went ahead and made another customer object, it would be at a different address. Let's call it customer 2. Any ID and name you put in customer 1 would only be associated with address 214. Any ID and name that you put in customer 2 would only be associated with the address 67. So these two objects are made from the same class, but they're considered separate objects. They have different data in them, which is also referred to not only as fields, but as the object's state. The object state is the data inside of them. Here's another example we're going to be using for the videos. This is a person class, and once again I'm going to inherit from the basic starting template called object, the starting class called object. In this case, I've defined a field called first name. I've set it to an empty string, and I've defined my first function, method, called toString, in which case I return the first name. And the self is being used here, and what the self does is it refers to the object that you're working with. It's self. It's a pronoun. So, for example, since this code is copied into address 214, when I go ahead and use the word self in address 214, it means address 214, object 1, object customer 1. Just as if I would go through and use the word self at address 67, the word self would indicate address 67. If I use the word me or myself, I mean, well, myself. If you use the word yourself, that means yourself. Of course, you wouldn't say yourself, you would say, let me think. myself. So two people standing on a corner. One says I myself, the other one says I myself. They're two different people, but the pronoun, of course, refers to each of them individually. The word, this word self is being used in that context. It just refers to the object instance. This is one object instance of customer. This is an object instance of customer. So I got two object instances of the customer class. In this case, I've made my person class. I've got a first name in it. I go ahead and create a brand new person object using this code right here. I don't have anything to pass in, so I just use empty parentheses. We'll see how to pass something in later on. Kind of looks like making a function call, but it's not really. I'll tell you why it looks like that a little later. But anyway, this syntax is going to go through and create a brand new object at its own little memory address, and then I can go ahead and set the field to, like Bob. I can make another one and set the field, same field, to Sue, but they're two different objects in memory. Now remember, a lot of the reason why you organize your code and things like this is so they can be reused. A person class is something that probably could be used in a lot of programs, anything working with, I don't know, people. So one of the nice things about a class is you could spend a lot of time working on it, getting it just right, and then reuse it in a number of other scripts. The other thing that's kind of nice about it is you can work with individual objects. We've worked a lot with lists and saw things like dictionaries, in which case you can put in name and value pairs. And then you can take a list or a dictionary and put it into another list and make a table. Well, with classes, it's kind of a little bit easier. The class can hold all your data by having a name and value, if you would. Of course, the name of the field and the value, the name of the field and the value, and then of course you could collect a group of persons into a list. So it's just another way of organizing your data, similar to the techniques we saw with lists and dictionaries and tuples, in that they can hold a collection of values. In the early days, you had basically a lot of arrays and loops that you tried to do this with. When people talk about a different way of programming, with object-oriented programming, a lot of it refers to the fact that before using this, you were using techniques like two-dimensional, three-dimensional arrays. And this actually helps to kind of organize your code into little building blocks called classes that you then make objects from. Now, we've seen how scripts can be reused and how it's great to organize them. When you make a class, there's also a kind of a standard pattern that you use to make them easier to read, easier to follow, and of course easier to reuse. So the general pattern would look kind of like this. You would have some kind of document string, and the document string I guess could start from here and then go down to here, to tell you the truth. And you'd have some little header information, such as the description or who developed it or what the date was or a change log. So very similar to what we've seen in scripts. You would also have a place for your fields, something called a constructor, which we'll get into in just a bit, attributes, properties, and methods. And all those things are what we're going to talk about going forward in this video series. And then the class would end. And of course, all these things are inside of the class because they're indented inside of the class in Python. So that would be kind of the logical structure that, or the logical pattern that you'd want to follow when you're going through and making your code. And if you are consistent, it makes your code easier to read and also easier for you to reuse and other people to reuse as well. Well, that's it for the overview of classes. Probably one of the best things to do is just kind of get right into using them. Before we do, let's take a look at how fields work. They're kind of one of the most simplest parts of a class, and we'll do that in the next video.